So again, you were testifying earlier about the damage to the Lexus being isolated in the area of the taillight, correct?
Correct.
And that was based on the information that you were providing, correct?
Correct.
Now, with respect to any of the materials that you were provided, was there anything in the materials that you were provided that indicated that just the arm or outstretched arm of Mr. O'Keefe interacted with the vehicle?
No.
And based on your review of any of the materials that you were provided, was there any information stating that Mr. O'Keefe had been struck in the back of the head by the taillight assembly of the Lexus?
No.
And based on any of the materials, let me ask you, based on any of the materials that you provided, were you aware that Mr. O'Keefe is on video exiting from a bar minutes before crash occurs at approximately 12:11 a.m. holding a cocktail glass in his right hand?
I'm not aware of that video.
Now, other than the materials that we just went over as far as the 10 things that you were provided, you weren't provided anything else, is that correct?
That would be correct.
And so sort of the questions that you endeavored to answer, those were questions that you didn't know from any of the materials that you were provided, is that correct?
If I understand your question correctly, there was nothing in the material that indicated the questions we were to answer, if that's what your question was.
That is my question. So there was nothing in there, is that correct?
Correct.
I may have a moment, Ron?
Yes.
You have some extensive background in human factors, correct?
Correct.
And as far as visibility, and in particular, have you ever conducted a visibility analysis?
Absolutely, hundreds of times.
And you talked a little bit about conspicuity, is that correct?
Yes.
And part of conspicuity, at least one of the factors, would be a reasonable expectation of, in particular when you're talking about a pedestrian, part of the conspicuity factors would include sort of a reasonable expectation that a pedestrian would be in the path of the vehicle. Is that fair to say?
I don't understand your question.
When you're talking about conspicuity or visibility analysis in particular, you're talking about something called PRT or perception reaction time, correct?
Well, that occurs after recognition. So first, a driver has to recognize that there's a pedestrian there before they can actually respond to it. So once they've recognized the pedestrian, then you start the perception response time where, again, the driver has identified what the hazard is. They're making a decision about what to do. They might be moving their foot from the accelerator pedal to the brake pedal. So again, kind of that's the action or the time frame in which the driver is undergoing action to potentially mitigate the collision.
And perception reaction time, that's a pretty commonly used industry sort of standard as far as crash reconstruction is, correct?
Well, I would say that it's used in the field of accident reconstruction, but as I mentioned earlier in my testimony, there isn't a blanket number in terms of perception response time. As I mentioned, it's based upon the hazard that the driver is presented with. Again, if you've got a pedestrian crossing the roadway, that's going to be one particular perception response time based upon studies and naturalistic data versus a driver suddenly stopping in front of you, right? It's not the same perception response time in every scenario.
Understood. And there's different variables that may affect that as far as someone's age, as far as the lighting that's available, other things. Is that correct?
Sure.
And one of those things might be the reasonable expectation of a pedestrian being present in the roadway as you're driving along, correct?
Expectancy can play a role, yes.
Expectancy, what we're talking about, sort of the disparity or the difference between driving along a country road where there's no houses for miles and miles versus an urban area where there's crosswalks every 15 feet, correct?
Sure.
Now, in that expectation of privacy, how high would that be if we're talking about a pedestrian that actually exited from the vehicle that then strikes?
I don't understand your question.
Let me ask you this. If the operator of the vehicle has a passenger who then exits the vehicle and goes towards the back, would there be a high reasonable expectation that the pedestrian would be located in that area?
I don't know if I would classify it as high.
Oh my goodness. Really? So, when a bus driver drops off your kids at the bus stop, you don't want them to wait because they should expect that there might be children crossing the street in front of them, behind them, crawling under the bus. Lord knows where they're going to be, those little munchkins. You're telling me that you have a passenger, you drop them off, it's pitch black and it's snowing and there's no lighting on the street, you don't have a reasonable motherfucking expectation that there is a pedestrian near your vehicle? I don't care how many degrees you have. That is one of the most unintelligent things I have ever heard. Sir. FKR. Mofo.
Would you classify it as?
I honestly don't know that I have a classification to it.
Keep smirking. Keep smirking all the way to prison.
Now, you never looked at the defendant's vehicle in this case, correct?
Correct.
Are you aware that the defendant's vehicle is still in police custody and available for inspection?
I'm not aware of it.
Very odd that they didn't look at her vehicle. Why don't you go look at ARCA's website? Why don't you go look at what they do? What do they do? I'd like to know how many instances they have not looked at a vehicle in reference to what they're investigating. I would be very curious as to those numbers. Maybe I'll call and talk to a higher up and find out, because that's pretty interesting to me.
Did you ever ask to look at the defense?
No.
Now,
So we believe that this man was hit by a car that we have in custody, but we're not going to give you the car, we're not going to show you the car, we're not going to talk about the car, and you're not going to ask about the car. Because you know exactly what you were there to do. Corruption, folks. Corruption.
a typical pedestrian strike, for the most part, involves a pedestrian in front of a vehicle as it's coming down the street. Is that fair to say?
That can be one type of interaction, yes.
Is that more prominently seen as far as your field than a rear collision?
I would say that's fair.
And there are various types of sort of interactions that the pedestrian can have with the vehicle in order to cause and sort of sustain injuries. Is that fair to say?
What I would say is that there's certainly, in terms of how the pedestrian interacts with the vehicle, in terms of whether they're being wrapped onto the vehicle or projected forward, certainly there's different types of interactions, yes.
So there's like a wrap and forward projection type of collision sequence. Is that correct?
Those are two common, yes.
There's also something called a fender vault. Is that correct?
Correct.
And sort of how or where that pedestrian is positioned with relation to the vehicle is somehow or somewhat determinative of the injury sustained. Is that correct?
It can be, yes.
Obviously, you're going to see different injuries if someone fender vaults and goes over the top of the vehicle versus someone who is projected forward from the collision sequence with the front of the vehicle.
Just to clarify again, in this matter, I was not assessing injuries. That was Dr. Rentschler. I don't have an opinion.
What I'm saying is based on your experience, so that you understand that there's a difference in the injuries that you might expect based on the type of interaction that a pedestrian has with the vehicle.
Yes.
And then if someone is wrapping forward projected and then the vehicle overruns that person, there'd be a whole other host of injuries that you'd expect to see based on being overrun by the vehicle, correct?
There could be, yes.
Now, the testing that you did with respect, these are essentially experiments that you're doing, correct?
That's fair, yes.
And am I correct in saying that in scientific experiments or in the world of scientific experiments, there are certain things called variables that you're trying to account for? Is that correct?
I would say that's fair, yes.
And essentially what you're trying to do is control as many of those variables as you can in order to best replicate whatever the conditions were at the time that what you're testing to see actually occurred. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, what, if anything, did you do to control variables in relation to temperature?
So one of the things we did with all of the tail lamp assemblies that we tested is that we preconditioned them to approximately 28 degrees, that they'd reached a steady state temperature before we subjected them to the impact testing.
And where in your report does it say that?
I don't believe that's explicitly stated.
Is it implicitly stated anywhere in your report?